About 20 years ago, when I was the managing editor of Foreign Affairs, Jeff Garten came to visit me and was, at that time, I think, working at Blackstone, and started talking about what he thought was going to be the big issue that we should be focusing on at Foreign Affairs, and it was the rise of the big emerging markets. Nobody really thought of them as big, nobody thought of them as emerging. Most people thought of these as developing countries prone to crises, booms and busts. And it's a sign, I think, of the way in which Jeff has been interested, aware, and prescient about this topic for a very long time. He writes in the book that he grew up on military bases, has been involved academically in globalization, has been in public policy on the forefronts of these issues, and so it's not a surprise at all that he should have this extraordinarily textured perspective about globalization. So with that, Jeff Garten. I just feel like I promised to introduce you, and I needed to introduce you.
That's great. I think I'll just say a few words about why I wrote the book and then turn it back over to you. I wish I could say that I wrote this book in order to explain this very important moment of globalization that we're living today. I wish I knew when I started this, which was about 7 years ago, just how fraught this moment would be, just how many tectonic plates would be shifting, just how many really big questions would face the public officials and business leaders and civil society. But actually, that's not why I wrote the book. I have had an interest in historical biography going back to the early 70s. I was a captain in the Army and stationed on the Thai-Burma border in 1971. Most of the time I was alone, and I would get my mail dropped from a plane. In those days, it was law that every American soldier had to get mail at least once a week. In fact, you even had to get a movie, so they would drop the mail and they would drop a reel. And normally, anything good had been stolen at the mailroom in Saigon or Bangkok. But one day, a book arrived. It was called Stilwell and the American Experience in China. It was the only thing I had to read, by Barbara Tuchman, and I read that book 3 times. And I was so taken by the medium of being able to explain an entire era through someone's life that I said to myself right there, that is what I wanted to do for a profession. Of course, it never happened. I went on to a whole bunch of other things. But several years ago, when I wanted to write a book about globalization, it came back to me that there is a way to do this through human beings, through people who did something spectacular and who themselves represented both an era and a set of circumstances that was very unique. And that by studying that, you actually could have a better understanding of what was going on today. The fact that I picked globalization made that all the more true because, as I found out starting with Genghis Khan, globalization is nowhere near a new phenomenon. And it goes back, 6,000 years. But I started with Genghis Khan and I ended with the end of the 20th century. And I came across some of the most interesting people I think ever existed. I picked 10. I think that the 10 that I picked are all worthy of selection. I'm sure others could substitute some other names. But every one of the people that I wrote about actually changed the world. Everyone inaugurated, in my view, an age of empire, an age of exploration, an age of global finance, an age of industrialization. And so I'm hoping that anyone who reads this book will never pick up a newspaper again and look at current events and not say, I have some deeper perspective than I had before. Or I can make an analogy that I never thought about making. And if I succeeded in that, then I'll be very happy.
Jeff, it's a wonderful book. It's a fascinating set of biographies. And I think that, as you say, they're very textured, and so people will draw from them what they want. I think we should spend a little bit of time talking about some of these people, but then inevitably we're going to have to talk, given your expertise and given that we have you, we're going to have to talk about this moment and globalization. Explain the much misunderstood Genghis Khan. We think of him as this barbarian, is almost synonymous with the idea of rape, pillage, and plunder. But you actually argue that he is in some ways the originator of globalization, and actually because he ruled both a very vast empire, knitted it together, but was actually a pretty good ruler.
I think it's fair to say that everyone I wrote about has his or her good or bad sides. And I picked people who, on balance, I felt, made a positive contribution to the world. It doesn't mean they didn't do some very nasty things. It doesn't mean they didn't leave in their wake huge problems. But on balance, I think that they all did something positive. And in Genghis Khan's case, what I'm trying to point out is that most people think the first golden age of globalization was the period that led up to the First World War, the 19th century and early 20th century. But in fact, if you look at the age of Genghis Khan, globalization absolutely flourished. He opened the Silk Roads in such a way that you could go from China all the way to Eastern Europe with no barriers. And so one of the things he did in a positive sense is he opened up old trade routes, which were really not trade routes at all. They were just a series of roads punctuated by enormous barriers. He understood the power of communications, and he created the first, let's call it a Pony Express, in which you could actually get messages all the way from the Pacific coast to Hungary. He had a way of governing which created not only these trade routes and these communication routes, but allowed these various cultures under the big political roof to flourish. In other words, he understood the power of local culture in a way that I don't think we do today. And I think he left a legacy through his sons and his grandsons that created a mixture of cultures and trade, such that, for example, some of there was enormous interaction between the Persians and the Chinese, the two great civilizations of the time. A lot of territory in between. And it was Genghis Khan and his sons who understood that you could mix all of this up, that you could take the advances in medicine in Persia and bring them to China, or the techniques of producing ceramics or silk in China and bring it to the Middle East. So I think there was these real beginnings of globalization of a kind that we know today. And that's what I tried to stress.
John D. Rockefeller, you make a point which I think is really often forgotten, that John D. Rockefeller became by far the richest man in the world, and probably, you know, if you can believe the kind of accounting that people try to do, many times richer than the current richest man in the world. Forbes points out that his net worth in today's dollars would be something like $350 billion, because of the government action to break up the Standard Oil. That is, that the broken up entity actually was worth much more than the original conglomerate, and that the shares of many of those entities rose, in some cases, 500%. And at that point, he decides to retire from Standard Oil, effectively, and starts giving his money away. So really, in an astonishingly short period of time, he builds this massive global empire. What do you think about Rockefeller made it possible to build such an extraordinary business that was also perhaps the first great global multinational in the modern sense of the word, as opposed to the East India Company, which go out and conquer countries?
I use Rockefeller as the person who inaugurated the industrial age. Starting with a couple of refineries around Cleveland, he built and owned pretty much the global petroleum industry. And I think he did it, first of all, he lent new meaning to aggressive business tactics. But remember, this was a time when there were no antitrust laws. This is a time when there was no taxation. But even in that rough and tumble arena, he was quicker, smarter, and actually he was an extraordinarily good manager. And his time had come. In fact, I think this is a good example. One of the conclusions that I have in the book is that these were great people, but they would not have been great people if history hadn't kind of dished up the opportunity. They didn't change history, in my view. I was attempting to say that they did because their achievements were enormous. They didn't bend the curve of history. They didn't bend the river. They just made the river go faster. And I think if it hadn't been Rockefeller, it would have been someone else who, at this time of industrialization, I mean, after all, he didn't discover oil. Someone else did. He just capitalized on it. He had an exquisite sense of control. You know, here's a guy who built a multinational corporation, never left the U.S. to do it. Would only work several hours a day. It wasn't like he was a workaholic. He just knew where the control points were. He was an accountant by training, and he also was an incredibly good selector of talent. He was surrounded by some very, very talented people. Every one of his acquisitions was made not only for the physical assets, but for the human assets. I think that Rockefeller, as a manager and leader, would stand up to any of the great business leaders today. But the point you were going to make, and I would just like to make this, is I picked him not just because of the petroleum, but when he retired, and as Fareed said, when he retired with all that money, he turned to global philanthropy. And he built global philanthropy on a business kind of basis. I mean, the parallel between him and Bill Gates, I think, is really quite powerful in the way that they use their business skills in order to figure out how to invest money for more social purposes. And Rockefeller was the first global philanthropist. When they set up the Rockefeller Foundation, it was global from the beginning. When they set up Rockefeller University, that was global medicine. So actually, I think he really was quite an amazing guy.
The other ones, you know, some of the other ones are, the reason you chose them is obvious. Deng Xiaoping opens up China to the world. Margaret Thatcher begins the market revolution, which includes, in a sense, a free trade revolution. Andy Grove, I can think we can imagine why you might have chosen him, but explain why you think he was so pivotal to globalization.
Well, I wanted to pick people from different arenas. And obviously, you can't talk about globalization without talking about the internet and the digital revolution. But I started to think that the real significance of the internet and the digital revolution is a broader revolution, right? It's really the third industrial revolution. Some people are already calling it the fourth industrial revolution. And Andrew Grove, aside from having a fascinating biography, was the person who figured out how to manufacture microchips on a mass global commercial scale. The microprocessor is the heart of everything that we think about when we think about the Internet of Things. Whether it's the automobiles, whether it's cell phones, whether it's 3D printing, at the heart of it is the microprocessor. And it was Andy Grove, as head of Intel, that not only made it, but made it in mass scale with exquisite quality. And I thought that since I ended the book with the end of the 20th century, I didn't need to think about Steve Jobs, who might have qualified for the book because most of what he did was in this century. And I didn't think that Bill Gates was on the same scale as Andy Grove in terms of lasting contribution. So that's why I chose him.
So now let's get to the present, and this will be my last question. You talk a lot about the cycles of globalization. In fact, what comes through in the book is that it's not a secular trend. There are these movements forward, regressions. Are we at a point today where we may be at the beginning of a regression, of a backward movement, after having had 25 or 30 very good years, maybe even a bit longer than that? So global trade has grown faster than global GDP for most of the post-war era. It is now growing slower than global GDP. It is expanding, but for the first time in decades, it's expanding slower than global GDP. And you only have to look at any Western country to see that the opposition to the free flow of goods, services, and people is becoming pretty nasty and strong. And so is it conceivable, how structural are the forces that move this forward so that, no matter what Donald Trump says or Marine Le Pen says or any of these people say, it won't matter? And how much is it contingent on if the United States, this is not inconceivable, were to have a president who would be significantly less of a free trader? If Britain were to leave the European Union, imagine 4 events like this happening in the next year. What happens to globalization?
Well, that is, of course, I think the biggest question around, and I'm going to start the answer. I'm not going to finish it because I think we ought to have a whole discussion about it. But if I relate it to what I wrote, I would, with total confidence, say that globalization cannot be stopped. That is, that the history of human beings is the history of globalization, or vice versa. There is no scenario, in my view, unless we blow ourselves up, in which 10, 20 years from now, globalization hasn't taken an enormous step forward. And I say that without value judgment. I just think that is inexorably where it's going to happen. In terms of the next, let's say, decade, just to pick an arbitrary period, there I think it is very likely that we will see some aspects of globalization slow and others really accelerate. I think you're right. It's possible that certainly trade in goods might slow. I think it's very possible that capital flows might slow or level off. But if you ask me about communication, I don't see any scenario in which more and more information is not zapped around the world at greater speeds. In terms of the spread of ideas, I think that is part of globalization, and we will see that happen at even warp speed. So I think we're probably entering a period of sort of what I would call multi-speed, with some aspects stalling and some increasing. And I do think that there is very plausible that on balance there's been too much globalization too fast, and that societies are going to have to digest this. And part of that will happen, or part of that is being reflected by the politicians who are very populist, nationalist, even xenophobic. But they can't stop it. Unless there's something about this era that is totally different from all of human history, our destiny is pretty clear.